Welcome to the Matneo podcast, where we'll discuss a range of topics surrounding maternity, birth and neonatal care. This podcast is produced by the Norfolk and Waveney local maternity and neonatal system and tailored to the multidisciplinary team across Norfolk and Waveney. If you are listening outside of this area, please consult your local guidance. Thank you for joining us. This episode discusses topics that may be distressing, including anxiety, depression and suicide. We acknowledge that these issues can affect both patients and healthcare professionals. Please look after your own well-being. Feel free to pause, skip, or stop listening at any time. If you find any of the content triggering, we encourage you to seek support from a colleague, peer, or appropriate mental health service. Welcome to the Matneo podcast, the podcast for healthcare professionals seeking deeper insights into the evolving landscape of perinatal care. I'm your host, Jo Govia, and today's episode focuses on a critical yet often under-recognised area of perinatal care, perinatal mental health. Mental health challenges during the perinatal period, which spans conception through to the first year postpartum, affect approximately 1 in 5 women, with growing recognition of similar challenges in partners and non-birthing parents. Yet despite its prevalence, perinatal mental health often goes undetected and undertreated across healthcare settings. In this episode, we'll examine the clinical presentation of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, the physiological impact these conditions have on pregnancy, explore current screening and diagnostic practices, and what we as professionals can do to support mental health. We will discover what happens after a referral is received by NHS Talking Therapies and what care pathways support women and birthing people in their perinatal journey. Joining us initially is Dr. Beth Revell. Beth is a consultant obstetrician specialising in perinatal mental health with 15 years obstetric experience. We will later be joined by Natalie Goult from NHS Talking Therapies. Natalie is a perinatal psychological therapist. Both professionals offer clinical expertise and evidence-based insights. Whether you work in maternity, obstetrics, neonatal care, primary care, psychiatry, nursing, or public health, this discussion is designed to support your understanding and improve your practice in this vital area of maternal and family health. Be sure to listen all the way through for the details. Hi Beth, thank you for joining us. It's so lovely to have you here with us to share your experience and expertise. I'd love it if you could tell us a little about yourself, if possible. So Beth, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you came to specialise in perinatal mental health as an obstetrician?
Hi Jo, yeah, delighted to. I suppose it comes from a background of growing up with a social worker as a mum, and so conversations around life, access, inequality has always been very much part of our family life, and you can't really escape those kind of conversations in a social work background. So she always describes me as a social work obstetrician or an obstetric social worker. But I think also working at the Norfolk and Norwich, we were relatively early adopters of acknowledgement of mental health in a kind of an environment that's probably the last 10-15 years has become a much more acknowledging is probably is the right word, is acknowledging that mental health is a big plays a big part in care, and that there are things that we can do to change. And so I was very grateful for that experience that kind of started with really good joint working between the perinatal teams as it emerged in the mental health care trust, but also obstetricians that go before me that started this process and very much inspired me with their care and their reasoning for do so.
Wow, thank you, Beth. That's so interesting to hear. It's almost like your kind of life has led you to this in a way, really, hasn't it? It's really interesting.
A little bit.
So thank you and welcome again. You kind of alluded to it a bit there. So while the awareness of mental health in perinatal care has really grown in recent years, so much of the guidance tends to focus on either severe mental illness or in the postnatal period specifically. Mm-hmm. There remains limited direction on managing mild to moderate mental health conditions in pregnancy. Mm-hmm. Could you speak to why mental health across the full spectrum of severity is such a critical component of obstetric care?
I think for most of us, our first thought around mental health is about people's ability to access care. So the reluctance to access care and feeling like they get an unequal service, and the future of their mental health and mental health as parents and also of their children is most people's kind of first thought about why it's so important to cover the whole spectrum. I mean, the other thing I suppose is that mild to moderate can very easily become severe in and around pregnancy, and so it's not that it's always stays the same in pregnancy, and it may be that it's just never had an opportunity to get that bad. So I suppose it's important to think about that message too. But it is also vital for ongoing physical health for mum and baby. So there are direct effects on the rate of preterm birth, on birth weight, on neurodevelopment of these children and physical development of these children. And so the phrase happy mum, happy baby really, really does ring true. It is vital, both emotionally for mums and the way they access care, but also physically for mums and babies. It has real significant changes on how babies experience pregnancy.
That's really helpful overview of why mental health needs to be such an integral part of obstetric care, and not just in the cases of severe illness. Like you said, we know that there's evidence that says mild to moderate mental health conditions, particularly when associated with chronic stress or anxiety, they can contribute to increased risks of preterm birth, low birth weight, and longer term developmental impact. With that in mind, can you walk us through what happens physiologically when a pregnant person experiences chronic stress?
You'll forgive me, I won't go completely cellular because my brain doesn't work really like that. But the effects of stress and cortisol in the routine, unstressed is probably the wrong phrase, but for someone who doesn't experience chronic stress and hasn't done so for a long time, or chronic anxiety, the placenta normally works in quite a protective fashion against cortisol. So it works as a bit of a barrier. Mum's cortisol can rise quite high in the event of one particular stressful period of time or event in pregnancy, and that can be protected. The baby can be protected from that. But if somebody is overwhelmed by that, so there is chronic anxiety, chronic stress on the background of insecurity in all sorts of manners, that placenta is less protective. And it's not entirely clear what about that placenta is less protective. There are thought to be gene expression that is different. There's thought to be that the quality of that placenta, not to make a judgment call, but the ability for that placenta to work in the way it wants to work is less maintained, and the protective nature against that rising cortisol is lost, and therefore baby can be affected by a relatively small rise in cortisol of the mum in a way that in the background population for whom are not suffering from chronic stress do not have that effect. And so those babies are exposed to every bump in the road from their mum's experience, and because of their mum's background, then those bumps in the road are more plentiful anyway. And so you've got a baby therefore that is not being able to neutralize that cortisol with the placenta, and therefore the growth is inhibited. The risk of chronic health conditions for a baby that's born smaller than it should be with a less healthy placenta, and on the background of a family that may be up against it socially, will all impact the chronic and long-term health of that child and that mum.
That's a really, really insightful explanation of the physiological pathways involved. And it really does highlight how mental health isn't just psychological, but has very real biological consequences for both the parent and for the baby. So with that in mind, it raises a really important clinical question. How do you risk assess stress and anxiety in pregnancy and spot the signs of something that as clinicians we should be concerned about? What would be the red flags?
I suppose the risk assessment is part of your daily conversation. So as midwives and as obstetricians and as health visitors, we come into contact with women and families all the time around what they can do, what they're managing to do. So the easy parts of the conversation is around what's their ability to function, what do they do for a living, are they still managing to do it? Just in the same way we would do if someone was suffering from hyperemesis, say. You'd say, are you getting out and about? Are you able to eat and drink? Are you able to go to work? You'd do the same around someone's mental health. So their ability to function to start with would be a really important part of that. And that's different for different people, isn't it? For some people, their normal is that they get out, they might do the school run for their children, and that's all they achieve in the day, but that is their normal and their baseline, versus someone who's that's been a big change and something's different about that. You'd also risk assess their reported self-harm activities. So for some people where cutting's a big part of their presentation, or drug use, their nutrition ability, so people who would restrict or binge or purge, and their suicidality, that should be assessed as part of your routine conversation. And it's taken a long time, I think, particularly for obstetricians. I think the midwives were very much earlier adopters of this, of conversations around how you feel and what that's leading you to think about. Has taken a long time to become part of people's normal conversation. And I still don't think it's particularly comfortable, because I still think there's a worry about what can I do with the information I get shared. But actually most people just want to be asked, and they want to know that they've got a safe space for that conversation to be held. I suppose one of the other things to think about is the support networks around that person. So, and what do their support networks think? So most people don't present with no one, they present with someone. And we may have thoughts and feelings about how reliable that person is, but they will also give you a bit more history and a bit more, is this a change for this person? Are you worried about them? And then the other stuff, and the stuff that I think our midwifery colleagues are much better at, around the security and the safety, so housing, finances, food, domestic violence, all the kind of stuff that comes around a family that you're looking at in terms of your causes for concern, will highlight who you're really worried about, who's got resource for being supported, who's got resource for who's going to pick this person up if actually this mild to moderate becomes severe, or you don't know if it's going to become severe, or you don't know if you haven't got the ability to monitor really, really closely for everybody. So who is going to be the safety net for this family? But when it comes to red flags, there's some really well-written, well-documented red flags, which I'll just go over. So 2 of them are very obvious, and they're for everybody suffering mental health concerns. But one of them is very specific to kind of pregnancy and new parenting. So the first one is a recent and significant change in mental health and the emergence of new symptoms. And that kind of lends it straight to the next one, which is about new thoughts or acts of violent self-harm. So one of the differences about women that die in pregnancy and through self-harm situations is that those, for most part, there's a real male-female divide when it comes to suicide. So there's, for most part, women will choose less violent acts. So they'll choose overdoses of drugs, they might choose some cutting, but their suicide attempts won't often be by jumping, hanging, shooting kind of acts. And apologies that, yes, you're right, that I think this podcast does require a trigger warning in terms of that conversation. But in pregnancy, the ones that we worry about are those that are having significant thoughts or plans that is increasing levels of violence, because there's something about that presentation that is more, they are more vulnerable to going through with that and being successful. And the final red flag is around new and persistent expressions of incompetency as a parent and estrangement from the child. So obviously that's only associated with parenting and their ability to predict how good they're going to be at parents if they're pregnant, or how they are coping with that very, very new and very confronting feeling of being a new parent. And I don't think any of us as parents would say that feeling is all the warm and fuzzies. And I think that was one of the easiest things to share and change with me as I became a parent, was the ability to go, oh, that bit where everyone says on every parenting podcast, or that great big rush of love. I think for a lot of parents that's nonsense. There's a whole world of anxiety. There's a whole world of trepidation about, oh goodness, there's a whole person I now need to bring up, and the acknowledgement of that as being a normal feeling, but also not allowing that to become, or at least being there to catch it if that becomes a more worrying, I can't do this, I'm not the right person for this baby. There's many more people that will be better than this than I am, because the bottom line is, for most children, their parent is going to be the best person to bring them up. And so we need to empower our families and allow them to be cared for by the right people if they haven't got that feeling and that confidence.
I completely agree, Beth. And I think that also brings us back to kind of the team around the family, isn't it? You know, that's why that is so important as well, because like you say, we've all had moments in our parenting journey where we think, oh my goodness, what am I doing? I'm rubbish at this. and that is being part of being a parent. That's what we go through. But I think that team around to kind of support them and boost them and just hold them when they're in that space is so important. Yes, I think that's really brilliant points. Thank you so much, Beth. So now we know what to look out for signs, symptoms and red flags. The next step is ensuring that we're actually able to identify and respond to those concerns in real world practice. But as many clinicians know, that's often easier said than done. What are the main barriers to identifying and managing perinatal health issues from a maternity perspective?
I think it's all about that old adage of stigma, because we're told and we're sold the story of parenting being this beautiful journey, and therefore we're all supposed to be terribly excited about every element of our pregnancies, every element of becoming parents. And whilst for most of us it's reasonably exciting and it's a joyful time, if you have to then admit and put your hand above the parapet and say it's not okay and I don't feel okay and I'm terrified and I'm really low and this is making me feel awful, then the fear of the judgment from your partner, your family, your healthcare professionals, that fear is really real. And I think on top of that, anybody who's ever been vulnerable in any other sphere other than just their mental health, and I don't mean to belittle the mental health on its own, but for a lot of families there will be other social vulnerabilities that will be around them. They worry and are fearful of social services input in regard to, if I can't look after my baby, who they're going to take it away from me. And so trying to unpick people's feelings about that this is around supporting and growing families rather than identifying red flags that means that you can't be a parent. I think those are really difficult conversations to start, but to acknowledge the fact that actually if your mental health is well cared for and you do have resources of your own to call on when the going gets tough, actually that will lead you to much more likelihood of having a successful family unit and staying together. But I think those are the two things. It's around the stigma and fear of not being able to care for your child that I think stop people admitting the way they feel. The concern about managing mental health concerns in pregnancy is always, as everything in the NHS, is about resource. So our ability to access the care. We've been very lucky in Norfolk to have such a proactive mental health team with regard to perinatal mental health. We were very much leaders nationally when it came to developing another MBU and developing a service. I think as time has passed, focus has changed and focus has differed away, but there's still an underlying understanding that this is a priority, but ensuring that the right people get the right care will always be a challenge, because you can't have all of it for everyone. There just isn't quite enough to go around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really, really important thing to highlight. And just to go in a little bit deeper to that, Beth, because as you say, the stigma is still huge in mental health. And I think, as you say, the whole society around childbirth and pregnancy, of this being this wonderful rosy time, is very different in reality, isn't it? So an editorial in Lancet did recently underscore this, stating that stigma remains a major factor and suggests that up to 70% of women may hide or minimise their symptoms due to fear, shame or lack of awareness, which 70% is massive when you think of the clients that we look after. It's a huge number of people. So just focusing down on that stigma a little more, do you have any thoughts on what we can do as both clinicians and as a wider health system to begin shifting that dynamic and reduce the stigma around perinatal mental health?
It's a make it normal conversation. Whilst I have to wholeheartedly admit that I don't formally do Hooli questions every time I speak to someone, I'm always asking, how do you feel? Is there anything putting you under extra stress? Honest questions for those for whom it's a real possibility about risk of dark thoughts, risk of self-harm. When's the last time you did? What's the last time you had a suicidal thought? Is that new? But that being, alongside, is the baby moving? Have you had your vaccines? So it is just part of your patter. I think that just has to be to take the fear out of the question. It's a bit like learning as medical students how to take a sexual history. I think there are conversations that are harder to make normal, but if you make it normal, then families appreciate the fact that it is just part of all care. I think my opener when I meet particularly very fearful teenagers in the main, but that's the start of a conversation of this is what my clinic is. So in this clinic, I meet women who have got vulnerabilities for all sorts of reasons. They could be vulnerable because they don't speak English. They could be vulnerable because they've just fled as a refugee to this country. They could be vulnerable because their mental health has been poor in the past or is currently poor. They could be vulnerable because they've had children removed or they've lost children through death or illness in the past. So try and make it that's what we're here for. So you're in a waiting room with a whole load of people who are going to ask these same questions. You're in a hospital service that is expecting to care for you. It's not that, oh, it's something we will brush under the carpet. So make it as normal as humanly possible.
Beth, thank you so much for sharing your insights. You've really helped us understand the clinical importance of perinatal mental health, the physiological impacts of stress, and the barriers we still need to overcome in maternity care. As we've heard, early identification and support are crucial, and that's where psychological services play such a vital role. To explore that further, I'm now joined by Natalie from NHS Talking Therapies, who will help us look at how these services support women experiencing anxiety, depression and other mental health challenges during the perinatal period. Natalie, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background, Natalie, and how you came to work as a perinatal psychological therapist in Talking Therapies?
Yeah, of course. So, to be honest, from a young age, I was always very keen on wanting to help people. Even as a child, I wanted to help others. And I was either going to be a vet or I was going to go and support people. So less about animals and more about people. So I didn't take the vet route. I did sort of psychology A-level, and I went on to do a counselling studies and undergraduate with psychology. So counselling studies with psychology, undergraduate degree, and then when I left university, I fell straight into the field of mental health. In terms of perinatal mental health, in all honesty, Jo, though I've treated lots of parents historically, it wasn't until I had a child of my own that I really became very passionate about supporting parents. So when I returned to work following maternity leave, I actually found that really difficult to return to work part-time. Talking Therapies and the NHS is quite a fast-paced service, and working part-time just felt a real adjustment. And a colleague said to me, look, why don't you help me with the perinatal pathway that we've got going? You know, that might help give you a bit of a focus coming back to work. And really, the rest is history. So my colleague noticed that I was probably struggling coming back to work, and that I am somebody that likes a focus and likes to get her teeth stuck into something. And that's what I started to get my teeth stuck into. And I think just realising that having a child of my own, parenting is really hard. It's really tough and it's amazing, but it's also challenging, and it throws up things and has thrown up things and continues to. My little one was born in 2018, and yeah, it continues to kind of throw up different challenges. So I think having had a baby, pregnancy, which may I add I didn't enjoy, birth, which may I add was an emergency C-section. So yeah, I there were things that sort of played out, and I think it's just realising that parenting's wonderful, but it's also quite a tough gig, and I just really wanted to be able to support as many parents as possible, having shared some experiences of being a parent myself. So in 2019, when I returned from maternity leave, that's been my focus, and I have sat within the perinatal pathway within Talking Therapies from that point, really.
Thank you, Natalie. That's really, really helpful. I think it's really interesting how obviously your career was shaped by a young age, sort of within your counselling journey, but it's sort of your experiences of your life that have brought you to this point. And obviously you've got this wealth of experience that you're bringing, which is fantastic. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts on communication, because as you say, perinatal experience is tough. We know it's tough, and we know it can be experienced in so many different ways. And we know from our conversations earlier that stigma plays a big part of it. So how much difference does how we ask the questions make? And what would you advise for asking questions that encourages disclosure?
Communication from healthcare professionals is vital. Feedback from women has been at times that the questions around mental health have felt a little, for want of a better expression, a bit tick boxy, that it's sort of the question's been asked, something's been written or something's been ticked, and then things have moved on quite quickly. And there hasn't been the opportunity to be able to talk about perhaps some of those struggles that might be happening. And I think when things can feel like they've been moved over quite quickly, it can unintentionally feed into that feeling around I shouldn't be feeling this way and nobody else feels this way. So I need to be quiet about it. So open questions are key, and I think also normalising and validating that actually it can be quite common for parents, for mums, to experience difficulties when pregnant. You're not on your own. And actually, I think even if a question around mental health within the sort of screening that maternity colleagues do, even if it was framed around it's not uncommon for women to struggle in pregnancy. I just wanted to check in and see how you've been feeling in this pregnancy, because sometimes people can feel anxious or can feel low, and just opening up the floor really to this can happen and does happen and it's okay to talk about. So I think those open questions are really important, and I think they are really important to ask from the word go. So as early as that booking appointment, whatever point that booking an appointment is, those questions, those open questions need to be asked of parents, but we're specifically mums if their partner isn't there. Because I think when we don't ask the questions openly and it feels a little bit sort of brushed over, it can feed into, I shouldn't be feeling this way, this isn't normal, there's something about me that's feeling this way. But I think the other side, Jo, is that I also appreciate that I have spent my life career in mental health. So there's a confidence that I have. It's my everyday. And I also appreciate that it can feel daunting asking those questions. But I would say that actually opening up those questions and just normalizing and validating those experiences of mums or dads that might be mentioning things as well is so powerful. And it just means that we can hopefully, if we're asking the right questions, the open questions early on, we can capture people that might be struggling before we get not too far, but before we get down the line and actually they're really struggling but haven't said anything earlier, but have almost got to the point where I've got to get help now because this isn't feeling okay.
Absolutely. And it is so helpful to hear how much impactful sensitive communication can have in creating a safe space for disclosure as well. Of course, encouraging someone to open up is only part of the picture, as we know. So what really makes a difference is having the right support in place once they do that. With that in mind, Natalie, would you be able to tell us a bit more about the perinatal pathway within NHS Talking Therapies and the work that's gone into developing it? What changes have been made recently to better support the individuals at this critical time?
There's so many parts to that question, and there's so many things that have been developed and happening. And I think one of the key things is that and actually in having those open conversations, it's about imparting that there is support there for parents if needed. And actually, we're really fortunate in Norfolk to have such a brilliant perinatal provision. And it doesn't just come from the perinatal community team who do an excellent job, but there is also the perinatal pathway within NHS Talking Therapies, which I think isn't always known. So when I talk about the perinatal pathway within NHS Talking Therapies, there are a number of clinicians, therapists, and other clinicians who have a specialist interest in supporting parents in the perinatal period. So pregnancy through to the age of 2. Within Talking Therapies, we prioritise parents who are either pregnant or have an infant under the age of 2. So their care is fast-tracked. We see them as soon as we can. And it may not be, though we have therapists and clinicians that sit within the pathway, there's not enough of us to go around for the need. There's quite a lot of parents that do come through that get support from us, and there's not enough of us to see every single one. However, what we do is we also share advice and guidance and supervision for our other colleagues that sit sort of in the wider pathway. So we're always having sort of supervision and sharing information of how best to support all of our perinatal parents coming through. And some of the things that we offer within Talking Therapies is cognitive behavioural therapy, counselling, interpersonal therapy is something that we offer as well. And we offer EMDR, and EMDR is a bit wordy, but it basically stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. But in short, it's a trauma therapy. So individuals that have, so women that have experienced birth trauma, for example, or a perinatal trauma of some sort, can look to get support from Talking Therapies, either with trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy or EMDR. And what's important for me to mention is that in terms of criteria for support from NHS Talking Therapies, it's a brief intervention service. So NHS Talking Therapies offers brief psychological intervention for those experiencing either mild and or moderate depression or anxiety. So anybody that is experiencing, whether you're in the perinatal period or not, mild to moderate depression and or anxiety can receive support from Talking Therapies. And what we, in terms of developing the pathway, what we've also come to realise and see patterns with is that we get a lot of women referred at, say, anywhere from 35 plus weeks. We've had women be referred at 38 weeks gestation who have sort of gone through their pregnancy, kind of trying to keep it all in, perhaps not thinking too much about the birth, but then are really anxious about the birth that's maybe in 2 weeks' time, due date wise. So we also have the ability to offer pre-birth sessions, because we recognise that we were seeing quite a lot of women coming through quite late stages of pregnancy, and we needed to see them quickly, whether that was for 1 session, 2 sessions, but to be able to do some anxiety management, a little bit of stabilisation, perhaps a bit of practical planning around the birth. And sometimes that involves us reaching out to the community midwife, sometimes it involves us reaching out to Skylark or the Eden team or the specialist midwife team at QEH. So yes, there's those pre-birth sessions that are available as well. And also I've talked about the sort of mild to moderate depression and anxiety, but it's really important. I think mental health services can feel, even when you're in them, like me, who has been for years, they can be quite confusing of who goes where and what threshold is what threshold. Within Norfolk, we have really good working relationships with Talking Therapies, the perinatal community team and the Lotus maternal mental health team. So we have regular meetings where we all meet and think about actually where is this person's need, mum's need in this instance, best met, and have those conversations to enable a smooth transition of care if that's needed. And I think from that, what that has minimised over time in developing the pathway is the bouncing around between services. It just feels, I think, more held for women that are in need of support.
It does sound like such a really well-rounded service, and I think those professional working relationships that you've got are just fantastic, and that they're holding those women so well, aren't they? So thank you so much for explaining that, and it's so
That's
encouraging
okay.
to hear about the progress and the thought that's gone into creating such a responsive and supportive perinatal pathway. So can you tell us a little bit about the practical side of things? So how we access, could you walk us through from the point of booking or self-referral? What does
Mhm.
the process typically look like, and what kind of timescales are involved?
Sure. So, in terms of referral, so you're quite right, Joe, people can self-refer or we receive professional referrals. People can self-refer via our website. There's an online referral form. They can call us, email us. It's really, really straightforward. And that's the same for professionals as well. And what happens when we receive that referral, however it's come in, it goes to our clinical system, if you like, and our mental health practitioners. So we have a team of mental health nurses who we call our mental health practitioners, and they will look at those referrals that are received, and they will take a look at if there's any history of that parent in, so we're talking about parents in this instance, so would look at whether there's any mental health history within talking therapies, if there's been previous episodes of care where they've perhaps received treatment from us, or they'll look on another clinical system which is called Lorenzo. And Lorenzo is the secondary care system, really. So they'll have a look on there to see whether there's any secondary care history and whether we need to think about whether talking therapies will meet that need, whether they're open to other services such as the community mental health team. If that's the case, then we might be thinking about, okay, I'm not sure whether this is the right time. We need to contact the community mental health team just to see what's kind of happening with this person. So again, there's lots of conversations. It's not referring open to another team, close. I think historically that's perhaps been an assumption or an experience from different professionals and maybe even people self-referring, but that's definitely not the case in the current climate. So our mental health practitioners will have a look at those referrals and make a decision at that point as to whether we are going to offer an assessment within talking therapies. If another team's involved, or if we think another team needs to be involved, if we're a little bit worried about what's in that referral or what's on the other clinical systems that we've got, we'll have those conversations with the professionals that we need to. Taking in mind that the referrals come in, and yes, we feel like talking therapies could offer some brief psychological support. What happens then is an assessment is offered. And the assessment will either be with a psychological wellbeing practitioner who they tend to sit more at the guided self-help, so a sort of a lighter touch approach, or it will be with a psychological therapist. And it really does depend what that referral says and what history there is. If it looks as though somebody's had previous therapy and struggled quite a lot, the likelihood is that we'll put that assessment forward to be with a psychological therapist, a perinatal therapist in this instance, or it may go to, if it feels like actually there's not been any previous history and it looks at the moment that it's lower level and it's more of a sort of early intervention preventative, then it will go in with one of our psychological wellbeing practitioners. That assessment takes place. It can either be over the phone, either video call, or if requested, we can offer face-to-face. Sometimes there is a little bit of a longer wait depending who's available in that area, but that certainly is an option. The assessment is carried out, and at that point, a decision is made about what pathway or what need do we need to sort of support here. And that just depends on what the presentation is. But it might be that somebody gets put forward for, it might be that a workshop around anxiety is enough. It might be that some lighter touch guided self-help appointments might be enough, or it might be actually counselling or therapy might be more appropriate depending on the presentation. So For example, if an assessment was undertaken and it looked as though that there were quite clearly symptoms of, say, PTSD from a birth trauma or from a perinatal trauma, or if there looks like the presentation was perhaps more so OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder, and maybe that's been exacerbated in pregnancy, that's likely to go in with a psychological therapist. And Talking Therapies works really to something that we call a stepped care model. So the lighter touch interventions, some of the workshops, guided self-help, individuals, one-to-one sessions of guided self-help, base it at step 2. And step 3 would be the therapy offer. And step 1 is that sort of primary care, go and see your GP, watchful waiting. And then as you move through the steps, step 4, for example, is more your sort of secondary mental health care.
Thank you, Natalie. And what kind of timescale would it be from that point of receiving the referral to having that first assessment appointment?
So in terms of our perinatal pathway, we have KPIs. So we have sort of targets, if you like. I hate to talk about targets, but that's sort of what it is, where we need to work towards offering an assessment and starting treatment within 4 weeks, within 28 days of receiving the referral. And we meet that. We're picking people up quickly. The only times that we might not meet that is if there's only certain days or times that people can do. So they can only do a Thursday afternoon from 1 till 3. So that really limits our ability to sort of meet that. But I would say on the whole, we are meeting that, and people aren't waiting. They're not often waiting longer than the sort of 28 days perinatal wise.
That's brilliant, isn't it? I mean, that 4 weeks is such a crucial period from if someone's actually made the disclosure that they are struggling, being able to see them so quickly is so important for them, just to kind of help make them feel supported and held in that process.
Absolutely. And I think what's important as well to sort of get a bit of an idea of the inner workings of the perinatal pathway and the team within it, so the team that I work closely with, there are times where we will get a referral and an assessment's been undertaken, and for example, there are some very mild bonding concerns, and if we're talking about in pregnancy, it might be that there's quite a high anxiety, therefore mum feels a little bit disconnected from her pregnancy due to fear. What we try and do, and we can't always do it, and we offer supervision with our colleagues if we can't, but if we do find that there is a mum or a dad that it really does feel like if we can if one of the perinatal therapists can offer that treatment, we do try and do that in cases where we might need to keep a little bit of a closer eye on that bonding, because the perinatal therapists, they're really aware of the other services that can support with that. So for example, the parent and infant relationship service and ECFS, so PAIRS, and then ECFS, which is the early childhood and family service. I meet with both of those services every 2 weeks to think about if there are any parents that are disclosing bonding difficulties, and we'll talk about whether referrals can go across there as well. So again, I think it just highlights that the perinatal parent-infant relationship services in Norfolk are really well linked with each other, and that just makes that sort of transition in pregnancy or postnatally really well held.
Thank you, Natalie. It's been a really valuable overview of how NHS Talking Therapies is supporting perinatal mental health in practice. So thank you very much for that. Beth and Natalie, thank you so much for your time, your insights, and for advocating for mental health in such a critical period of life. As a final thought from you both before we go, Beth, if you had to pick one thing, what would your key takeaway for our listeners be from today?
I suppose it's quite a feminist soapbox stance, but improving the care for women in all spheres of healthcare, but especially around birth, improves the health and prosperity of your nation. So it should never be underestimated.
Thank you. So finally, Natalie, what would your key takeaway for our listeners be from today?
Okay, key takeaway. Well, I'm going to be greedy, Joe, and I'm going to say 2 because there's 2 things that just really stand out in my head. And number 1 is just from the word go, ask the question, ask those open questions, professional curiosity about how somebody's feeling, normalizing that it's very common, it can be very typical to struggle in pregnancy and postnatally. And then that's part 1. Part 2 is refer. If in doubt, refer. I think sometimes we wait because parents say, I think I'm all right at the moment, but I'll let you know if it worsens. And actually, my key message would be, if you're unsure and if that mum or that dad in front of you is happy to be referred, then please do. Because as I've already mentioned, the services within Norfolk perinatally and parent-infant mental health talk to each other. There's not really a wrong door. So if you make a referral and it's not quite the right place, we can give that feedback. We can redirect it to the most appropriate service. So if you're not sure and you think, do I, don't I always think do, because even if somebody has an assessment and at that moment in time they don't need support, at least they know that there's hopefully a really friendly service that is there to support, and if they change their mind at any point, they can come back and self-refer or be re-referred. It's starting to break down those barriers around mental health, perinatal mental health. So yes, ask those open questions and remember about professional curiosity, and if in doubt, refer, because the support is there. And actually, a lot of what we're trying to do at the moment is about early intervention, preventative. So if somebody is struggling at a lower level, the support's there, let's make the most of it, and they may not need more intensive support going forward.
Thank you both so much. That concludes today's episode on perinatal mental health. We hope this discussion has provided you with valuable insights into the physiology, identification and support strategies for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders in clinical practice. If you found this episode informative, we encourage you to explore additional continuing education resources and stay current with the latest research and guidelines in maternal mental health. To obtain a free certificate for your CPD portfolio, please complete the post-episode assessment available as a link in the comments section of this episode. You'll also find current guidelines and literature mentioned in the episode. As always, we welcome your feedback and encourage you to share this episode with colleagues across disciplines who are involved in perinatal and reproductive care. Thanks for listening to the Matt Neo podcast, where clinical knowledge meets practical impact. Until next time, stay informed and stay connected.